Thank you everyone for coming. We may have some more people sort of trickling in as we get started, but we'll get started with the panel on education. This is the only education-focused panel at the Oxford Gen AI Summit, and so we're excited to have some really special guests with us on the panel today. I'll start by introducing each of them, but I'll give them 2 minutes or so to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their work and their connection with an interest in generative AI. So we'll start with Philip Colligan, who's the CEO of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, which is an educational charity looking to help young people realize potential through computing and technology. So I'll let you start.
Oh, right. Hi, I'm Philip. So I am Chief Exec of Raspberry Pi. So we started out life making computers, which we still do, but we're an educational charity that owns a computer company. So the foundation is a charity focused on mainly school-age children and helping them realize their full potential through the power of technologies. I'll cover the company first, though. So we own all the shares, or most of the shares in Raspberry Pi Limited, which started life as an educational computer company, has now sold 55 million computers. Raspberry Pi 5 has just launched. It is between a third and a half the speed of your top-end MacBook for $65, available on all good online outlets now. The foundation helps schools and school systems introduce computer science in the broadest sense, so from digital skills all the way now to AI literacy and advanced computer science qualifications. And we do that through resources for the classroom, training and CPD for educators, and platforms and tools that are used by teachers and students. And we also have a research centre at the University of Cambridge, so everything we do is informed by the world's best research, but we're also undertaking original research into computer science education, AI literacy, so most of our programmes have PhD students attached to them now who are doing all the good things that an educational research establishment should do. So happy to talk more about that.
Thank you very much, Philip. So we'll move on to Laura Knight, who joins us as she's a senior consultant at Berkhamsted School, having previously been the Director of Digital Learning.
That's me. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So my work centres around teaching and learning. I teach every children in the sort of year 7 to year 13 bracket in a group of independent schools in Hertfordshire. But I also work as a consultant with different schools groups, other educational leaders, associations and universities, thinking about innovation, thinking about digital strategy, and obviously at the moment a lot of the conversations I'm having are around AI. I'm really interested in this space from a pedagogical point of view, but also from a digital well-being and safeguarding perspective, and doing lots of work at the moment about particularly aspects to do with teacher workload and how AI can be used as a lever in that space, and answering some of the tricky questions around assessment, ethics and integrity as well.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Laura. And our third panelist is Professor Jeremy Knox. He's an associate professor at the Department of Education at the University of Oxford and formerly from the University of Edinburgh, where he was a lecturer in digital education. Jeremy.
Thank you very much. Well, firstly, just to thank Will and Cassidy and the others organising this Oxford Gen Summit. Very pleased to be able to contribute in a small way. Of course, thanks to Liam for chairing this panel. So I suppose it might be useful to say my research over the previous few years has been in the area of trying to understand how technologies like AI, data-driven technologies, shape education, change relationships between teachers and students, change the ways that institutions are governed and so on. And if I can do one small shameless plug, I have a book out this year, just out with Routledge, called AI and Education in China. I ask your libraries to buy it.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'll do a quick overview just sort of what are some of the themes we're going to be talking about today, and then we'll jump into the questions. AI in education, it's not new with ChatGPT, though it's sort of come onto the scene, of course, with sort of generative AI in the mainstream consciousness in the education system. The discussion around AI in education actually sort of goes back. The big word was personalization. So about how do you help students improve their learning thanks to AI tools. So one of the questions that I've had is around how do you stop AI from just sort of reinforcing and using tech in a very traditional way to sort of reinforce sort of traditional, 20th century schooling structures in terms of assessment, in terms of learning. And this is one of the things that we've sort of come into the question around personalized learning. So essentially you have the discussion around what can AI do. AI can be a peer learner for students. AI can help students reinforce their algebra, so they have their algebra problem set, and the students can get into, thanks to AI, can identify exactly which questions they're getting wrong and give them recommendations for improvement. That's just one example of what we're looking at. And so you have this whole discussion around personalization, which ties in with sort of student data, and of course discussions around integrations with learning management systems as well. So this is some of the stuff that has sort of been in discussion about AI in education, sort of prior to the ChatGPT and the generative AI revolution. And we know that this sort of traditional approach has some limitations, and that we'll discuss hopefully today as well. But more broadly, and the interesting sort of element, and we referenced it already, Laura mentioned as well, just questions around teacher workload, for example. How can generative AI actually allow, instead of sort of reinforcing sort of traditional structures, can it actually be sort of a tool that can help improve divergent thinking, improve creative processes for teachers and for students, of course, to explore, to create, to design? All of these questions are things that we can get into today. And so the new word is now perhaps enablement, with personalization, that we can look at as we look at the opportunities that this might have. So with that, I will of course also mention at the end, we'll get into some questions around sort of the risks, limitations, and other things that we have and face, particularly with regard to sort of inequalities that we see around the introduction of AI in schools as well. So with that, we'll get on to our first question. We'll look at sort of trends and impacts. So our first question for the panel is, how are developments in generative AI presently impacting education, and what type of trends are you seeing in your work? And we all come at it from very different perspectives, some from in school in the background, some from the sort of tech sector, and then of course as well from academia. So hopefully we'll look at it from a wide range of perspectives here. Philip, would you like to start?
I'll put a caveat, like there's going to be a question about AI literacy, so I won't say too much about AI literacy, which is what I think is super interesting in all of this. I think the first trend is that's all we're talking about all of a sudden, which I think is problematic. I think it's wonderful to be exploring how AI technologies can transform education, but we can't stop talking about how education needs to be transformed irrespective of AI technologies. And I was at MIT last week, lots of discussions around this sort of stuff, and one of the really interesting threads of that discussion was precisely this: how do we make sure that AI technologies aren't just making our existing education processes more efficient and therefore preventing us having a debate about whether we should be changing assessment or moving more towards project-based learning or thinking more about implementing creativity. So I think that's, one of my first points is I love the fact that I spend all my weekends talking about AI in education, but really that is all anyone wants to talk about at the moment, and maybe we should pause that. I think one of the areas that we're exploring, and we think is super interesting, you mentioned it, is the idea of AI systems in their role as not just feedback, but coaching, tutoring, a little bit more than just error messaging systems. And I think that's an area which we're just starting to explore. And I think there's some really interesting experiments happening around the world on that. You've seen the stuff that Khan Academy is doing, which is problematic and exciting in equal measures, really. But I think that idea, we know, don't we, from educational research over many decades, that feedback is one of the most significant things that can help a young person learn. I focus very much on young people in this context. But there are rate-limiting steps to how much feedback a young person can get, and one of those is teacher time and capacity. And that's not a fungible resource. We can't expand that very easily. So I think exploring how these systems could be used to provide better quality feedback, encouragement, coaching to young people, I think that's an area.
Absolutely. Thank you. Laura?
Great. So I want to build on a couple of things that you've said, if that's all right. First of all, to talk a bit more about personalisation and assessment and feedback, that whole loop designed to inform and motivate progress for students. One of the things that has actually worried me quite a lot is the way that personalisation has been used as a kind of magic word, a sort of totemic word, actually. The minute that you have a conversation, even with AI itself, around what the benefits of AI might be for education, one of the very first things that comes up is personalisation. And I think that it's absolutely important that we should think about it, but we need to unpick it a little bit and reflect on how that might impact on things like accessibility and differentiation and making sure that students' needs are met. But also, we must not forget that there is a fundamental, structural, cultural thing called school, which is a collective community activity. And there is a tension between the individual and the personal, which, let's face it, is a societal tension, right? And it's something that, millennials growing up will be able to talk quite fluently about, and certainly the generations after that. So we've got this individualistic aspect of existence and learning, but also the need for culture and community to thrive and to make sure that school remains at the heart of its community, that it teaches the social and emotional aspects, and that learning happens in that collective way. And fundamentally, young people, for the most part, enjoy the collective aspects of learning and benefit from it. So before we get too sort of hung up on personalizing every tiny thing, let's remember that there is a community at the heart of it. At the heart of that community with those kids are teachers who are fundamentally overworked and underpaid. So let's make sure that when we're thinking about the levers we can pull in this space, that we are not adding to workload and making life more complicated, but we are looking to simplify, to streamline, to make things more efficient and generally more helpful for those busy professionals. Because the intellectual labor and the personal benefit that they bring to their work is what we should be really favouring, and using AI to support that rather than some sort of, intellectual offloading, which I think is perhaps less helpful. We need to make sure that what is valuable in the human relationships is cherished, and then that is supported by the technological aspects. Now, in terms of trends of what we're seeing in schools right now, I do lots of work both internally and externally with other schools, and I'm seeing a really interesting combination of absolutely predictable techno-panic, which is the same thing we always see with that rising lift towards, on those Gartner graphs, we know the ones, right? And therefore a really predictable desire for control and management. So school leaders want to know, well, first of all, what is this? How do I control it? And how do I make sure it's safe? Because our first goal is obviously safeguarding and making sure that kids are safe. But equally then, there is this question around integrity that's going to be in the heart of lots of our conversations today, I'm sure, and around what it means to learn, what it means to gain knowledge and skill, and how we can make sure that those things are not compromised but are enriched. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Rob. Professor Knox.
Well, I guess the view from universities, and I should say I found myself nodding frequently to the previous responses to this point. I suppose the views from the university space is which is what I've been trying to map over the previous few months, relate to policy, teaching and research. And I can say just a few things to address each of those. Reflecting some of the things we've just heard, I think from a policy space, there's first and foremost been a lot of fear and resistance, particularly around protecting the integrity of assessments, given that within the higher education space, the essay is very dominant as a key instrument of assessment. But we've also seen, and this is one of the key examples of this, is the paper released by the Department of Education in the last few months. Certainly had the concerns about assessment there, but also, I think, sort of elevated the discussion towards implications for knowledge and intellectual capability and so on, that some of these tools usher in, given that they automate some of the writing process potentially for students. There's certainly a noticeable interest in a sort of teaching practitioner space of a real interest in the pedagogical benefits of using generative AI, and particularly the sort of chat GPT examples. And there's a whole array of great literature now on prompts that you can use to generate teaching plans and all sorts of other things. There's a useful UNESCO report that came out a few months ago, which went through various examples of things you can use these generative AI systems for. The Socratic opponent to encourage students to engage in dialogue and so on. The co-designer to help teachers enhance lesson plans and so on. So there's a great interest in what can be done with these tools. There's a third area which I've been looking at, which is more in the research space, where there's a lot more concern about these kind of technologies, that I would say is an area of a bit more interest, given the first area is about concern and fear, the second area is about embracing the technology. I think that the third area I've been looking at research is, I think, a lot more critical, and trying to understand some of the issues that are being raised around increasing prevalence of private companies in public education spaces, in state education, and we're certainly seeing a great interest from the edtech sector in the promise of generative AI. A concern about the surveillance infrastructure, which underpins a lot of these technologies, and what that means when we're both utilising and exposing our students to systems which surveil a great deal and collect a great deal of data and raise all sorts of issues, not only about copyright, but about the ethics of that. And thirdly, a lot of interesting research about the labour implications and the sustainability of these technologies. These are technologies which don't only employ clever techies who work in offices in Silicon Valley to program these technologies, also employ low-paid workers in Kenya, in Indonesia, and so on, who correct the mistakes that a lot of these technologies make and get paid very little to do so. There's also increasing environmental concerns about the data centers and so on, which use huge amounts of water and a lot of power to engage in the computation that makes the nice essay appear in front of us. So there's a range of concerns there. I would say there are building in the research space around in universities which are causing some concern. But there's a balance there between positive ways of, as we heard, challenging established and traditional ideas of assessment, but also some concerns about the implications for using those technologies without much reflection on where they're coming from.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. There's a few points we could potentially pick up on. One was the question of integrity that we mentioned. And it sort of ties into how we teach students about AI, which is sort of our next question. But perhaps if we just want to pick up on that question of integrity.
Sure. And I think this is a really interesting one. And I would like us to take a sort of a moment to zoom out for a moment, because I think it's really easy as the adults here to talk about how it's the students and the young people who should be careful about how they use tools with integrity. But actually, it's about everybody culturally making a decision about this. I've had some really interesting conversations lately on how school leaders enjoy the certainty of structure and regulation and policy and everyone being clear on what the right thing is to do. Because if we know what the right thing is to do and everyone follows the rules, we can all succeed and it's going to be fine. But the minute that you destabilise that with tools that actually blur the boundaries on what the right thing to do is, then things start getting a bit more complicated. Now, in the talk before lunch, and we were talking about looms and slide rules and cranes, and I thought this was really, really interesting. Ethically, we tend to feel okay about looms because it's not compromising the intellectual hard work of the person who's doing it. We're okay-ish about slide rules, as long as you make a point of being open about it and you share your slide rule with everybody. But cranes are really disruptive, and actually people think, my goodness me, this looks like cheating. Is this even right? Who says that that's okay? Have we agreed this? Do we have a policy? So I think the more transformative and the more innovative the AI solution is and the less familiar it looks, the more destabilizing that can be in terms of understanding what the integrity expectations are. And so some really open conversations are needed. Now, part of the challenge that we have in education is that there is a social contract about what is expected between teacher and student, between head teacher and parent. All of those things exist on a set of really clearly defined expectations. And those are grounded in this sort of generational experience. What you expect as a parent is a lot related to what you experience as a child. And you have this kind of, it's almost like a 30-year cycle going on there. Now, the minute we change those rules, a whole cohort of parents who have never experienced this kind of thing before are suddenly going to say, well, hang on a minute, what do you mean you didn't write that report yourself? I want you to write the report. I want you to sit by candlelight with a quill and write that report. I want my pound of flesh, because that shows that you love my child and you care about my child and their learning. We offload those kinds of relational units of, I don't know, trust, if you can think about it as a unit of trust, in a way, I think that's really at our risk. And so using, to think very carefully about transparency, to think very carefully about what we say is okay and is not okay, to create new norms in this space is empowering. The minute, and I've said this in conferences before and it gets a bit of a shudder, so apologies, but the minute that using AI is a professional dirty little secret amongst teachers and academics and university staff, that's a problem. Because what it says is, I'm going to fake it until someone calls me out. And if we're modelling that to kids, like that's going to be fairly disastrous. Now, in the attention economy that children are growing up in right now, they have been groomed, essentially, to expect everything that comes at them to be filtered, to see everything through a lens of artificial perfection. So they're used to that to a degree and will be cynical about to what extent what they see is authentic. That doesn't mean that we should expect them to just have new rules about what truth is and where, trust comes from.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just make one tiny point. Really great intervention. I learned a lot there. But just in our work, we've literally just decided on Friday that everything we publish which has used any generative AI will include a statement that it included generative AI and what it will do.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be going into our teaching resources, which will go into the hands of teachers and young people. And my team is slightly horrified because they're all like, well, we use it quite a lot. So I kind of, well, that's fine. We should be open about it. And I think that transparency...
But isn't it interesting how they see that as an admission of some kind of guilt?
That's everything from blogs to articles to, kind of the educational resources we produce. But I do think there's something... It's a clumsy device. I think as we navigate this territory, not just for kids doing their exams, but all of us thinking about to what extent is it helpful, appropriate, meaningful to explain the uses that you're putting these technologies to, I think is a really interesting question.
And where the data's going, frankly, because if we are putting intellectual output that has come from another individual who is not ourselves into AI in a bid to whatever, analyse, explore, compare, whatever, we are then compromising the privacy of another individual and their intellectual property, which comes back again to this integrity piece, doesn't it? That's complicated.
Well, I think, and I don't want to take us off the point, but I think one of the big questions about essentially edtech tools being used in schools, I think, they will be more effective if the data that young people are producing, whatever that looks like, is fed back into the model to train them, right? We can all agree that the models will get better if they have more data. The problem then is, precisely, right? Who owns that data? Who's monetizing that data?
Right.
And is it okay for young people's data to go into a commercial enterprise, right? Your reaction. Now, the thing that I would like to see is some kind of standard around this, like a kite mark that edtech tools could sign up to, which would, because the purchasing power is not in the hands of the young people, by the way, they're just going to get given stuff by parents and teachers. But if we could work towards some sort of standards for edtech tools around privacy, data, transparency, and then that becomes economically important for an edtech tool to have because it's more likely to get purchased, then we can start to see some change.
And such interesting and timely thoughts there, because so I went to the Houses of Parliament to see Lord Jim Knight to talk about exactly this recently. Having finished his work on the Online Safety Bill, he is now exploring this question around data and who it belongs to, and how for so many of our young people who are used to being the product, their eyeballs are for sale, essentially, they do not have a sense that their data is worth anything. But yet there are so many folks who will capitalise on it and who will be making money out of their inputs. And I worry that actually when we come back to thinking around digital inequalities and gaps, where schools are in more privileged situations, they will be able to afford to pay for the premium model with the extra additional security and the walled garden data approaches. And it will be those students who are on the free version who are paying with their data and who are therefore compromising on their own intellectual property, but also on the privacy of their outputs.
And I'd like to get back to that after.
Sure, sorry.
But just on Professor Knox, just on the question, perhaps in higher ed, is there a difference in this discussion around integrity and sort of data ownership and other questions?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure there is a great deal of difference. It is interesting to hear, I think in particular, that focus on the sort of education professional and their use of these technologies to do teaching work. I don't hear so much of that conversation in higher education. Perhaps I'm just not privy to that kind of discussion. Just making lots of notes as colleagues here were speaking. I do think the kite mark is an interesting one, and of course of great value in an educational space. My one question there would be, well, how do you get an industry to agree with that kind of that step? And my interest is often in design work and participatory design, and that would be one way I would suggest you could get to that point, is to actually open the doors to the design process, start to bring in. And I know the typical response from colleagues who do a lot of work in this area often talk about user design, agile design, responding to users, but I think in educational spaces we tend to mean that in a much broader way. Widening the stakeholder voices in the design process, getting teachers in the room with designers, getting students in the room with designers, really listening to the views and the opinions they have, and using that process to drive how these technologies are designed. And for me, that would be one way to get something good in, like a kite mark, which would recognise those sorts of examples.
It shouldn't be a luxury. That shouldn't be a nice to have, I don't think. I think the agency amongst teacher populations in this country is growing, and gone are the days when everyone would go to vet once a year and be told what they needed to buy by edtech companies, and now folks are expecting much more to be able to define what teaching and learning looks like with digital. So I think that edtech companies should expect to be consultative and to start with, well, which problems can we solve for you, rather than here's a problem that you didn't know you had.
Completely. Well, that's great. Why don't we move on to the question around teaching students about AI and especially sort of AI curriculum and this kind of question. I guess that's the question. How should educators teach students about AI? And if you want to comment potentially on, does the curriculum need to be adapted, improved, transformed, replaced? How do you feel about sort of these questions?
Yeah. So I'll try and be brief, although we're spending a lot of time thinking about this. So the first thing is we haven't yet, society hasn't really defined what learning outcomes we're talking about when it comes to AI literacy. No. That's a big piece of work we've been doing. My research team analysed 500, they stopped at 500, AI literacy K-12 materials and initiatives. And honestly, it's all over the shop in terms of what is it that young people are meant to be learning from these activities. And we've got a real problem with lots of demand. Schools really want this content at the moment, but the content is not of a high quality. And that's long-term problematic, because kids are developing misconceptions that are going to take a lot of work to deconstruct later on. So we've been doing some work on this idea of unpacking a sort of stack. You've got social and ethical issues, you've got issues around applications, human-computer interactions, you've got then a set of questions around the data and how models are being trained, and then the underlying engines. And we think that there are learning outcomes that are relevant. We've started from the age of 11, so we've done 11 to 14 initially, that are relevant and useful for young people to acquire, so knowledge, skills, mindsets that relate to each of those. We've done it's all published, so you can go and see it. And we've done good work, I think, on progression, so which concepts do you need to understand in which order, and really trying to address issues like anthropomorphization. So one of the things we are learning is that if we talk about these systems as though they're human, kids develop misconceptions that they really prevents them understanding more advanced concepts. Yes. And so we launched a thing called Experience AI, which is totally free. It's out there now, and we've had like a couple of 100,000, I think, young people learning with it already. But we don't know where it sits in the curriculum. So we've done this, and teachers love it, and they're using it in one-off lessons and in sequences. But I think there's something about where that sits. It's not necessarily in the computer science curriculum. But then the second thing is we really need to interrogate our existing curricula and where AI sit within those. So computer science for sure needs to change. We might come on to, do we need to teach programming anymore? Spoiler, yes. But then if you look at biology, so we've just released a unit on ecosystems, which slots into the English curriculum, GCSE curriculum. but which brings AI into it, which it never imagined, right? The curriculum was never written with AI in mind. And I think there are ways that we can look at existing science and humanities curricula and design units that teachers can teach, which meet the existing curricular requirements, but also start to introduce AI concepts. The final thing I'll say, and I'll shut up, is the thing we've got to remember is that practically every computer science lesson taught up to now and in the future forever is taught by a non-specialist teacher. There's a small number of brilliant computer science teachers that have a qualification, but believe me, they are the rarity. And the same is true of AI. Almost every teacher who's going to stand up and try and teach an AI class will not have a qualification in the subject. And so the responsibility on those of us that exist to support teachers is to understand that and to help them develop their skills alongside young people. And so any curricula, anything we talk about AI literacy has got to start with teacher professional development.
Okay.
Totally agree on the teacher professional development. I think that is hugely important. But it needs to come from reputable places. I wonder if you remember the sorts of articles that used to appear in the 80s and 90s Women's Own magazine, like 50 Ways with Mince. Really uninspiring lists of recipes, like that nobody ever really asked for or ever really needed, but just fill space. The challenge that we have in the professional development space is there are a lot of people creating, and I say this with kindness, absolute dross. It's really important that we find high quality learning experiences for teachers which genuinely are going to upskill them, rather than just show them 50 cool things you can do with this new shiny tool, which by the way will have changed so drastically by next term you won't recognise it. We've got to give them agile capabilities which are based on principles rather than really deep learning on a single tool, because frankly that's outdated within seconds. We also need to be in very balancing, I guess, the idea of being principled about what you're learning and also being agile and quick with it. So it's both of those things. Now, as far as the literacy piece is concerned, I totally agree with you that digital literacy and AI literacy is something that is not the computer scientist's job. It is, in fact, everybody's job, and that's uncomfortable. But I think it's true. And that we need to find ways to deliver that learning in a cross-curricular high quality manner. Now at Berkhamsted we've been teaching kids about machine learning and AI for years now as part of our IT and computer science programs. So and big shout out to the Apps for Good folks, because they've also created some brilliant stuff back in the day. But I do think we need to teach young people from when they are really quite little about the risks associated with synthetic experiences and relationships, and particularly dealing with this idea of magic and mystery. So many young people, even teenagers who you would hope would know better, will resort to magic and mystery as their metaphor of choice when talking about AI. They really will think about it as fairies and elves and something like Father Christmas. So we have to use better quality metaphors. Please, for the love of all that is technical, stop using cute pictures of robot dogs and people looking skyward with kind of virtual reality goggles on when you're talking about AI. It's so unhelpful and disingenuous to use imagery that is completely irrelevant to the tech you're talking about. AI looks like a search box. It's utterly unremarkable to look at from the outside, and so they're expecting this kind of magical, mystery, amazing, robotic, cyborg hero, and they're getting a search box. Well, this is just what I ask it to tell me answers, surely. So let's be careful about that, and then find ways to build in understanding of what's inside the black box and what it really means.
Great, thank you.
I'd like to just say one thing about the qualifications for teachers. I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about. I was in a fantastic talk the other day from the Oxford Internet Institute just here in Oxford about the sort of traction of the machine learning job, and in that work, the team there had, as I think is widely known, discussed how qualifications in those areas of specific machine learning techniques and so on happens largely outside of formal education and happens in sort of other training areas. So the idea that somebody would have something like a DPhil or a PhD or a master's in these specific techniques was pretty rare. So, that in one sense that explains the lack of qualified teachers, but you also have to factor in how teachers get paid so little for what they do.
Oh, yeah.
And in that research, one of the things he highlighted was that, machine learning technician in California will be on, $200,000 kind of salary.
That's the graduate salary. That's the entry.
Exactly.
Point.
So how would if somebody's got a qualification, why would they go and teach in a secondary school in the UK, for example? So that's an interesting one to unpack, I think. But I'm absolutely on the side of. It's very interesting to hear some of these examples about and the discussion of where teaching about AI fits. My view, and this is something I've been involved in with a research project, I should say, led by David Lundy at the University of Glasgow, called Teaching for Digital Citizenship, which is trying to understand exactly where this kind of education might fit in. And our work there is about trying to emphasize the interdisciplinary nature of these kinds of technologies. And as we've just heard in some of the examples, and I imagine in the other panels across the conference yesterday and today, these kind of technologies touch on a whole range of societal issues, and I think mean that if we just try to teach them in a computer science classroom, we're drawing quite artificial boundaries around the impacts that they have very broadly on border crossings, our ability to vote. You name it, these technologies are going to impinge on society very broadly. So what we're trying to do there is imagine how something like citizenship education might take on part of this, given in the context that in the UK, citizenship education has been depoliticised for the past 30 years or so. We need a much more critical conversation about these technologies, and to bring that back, I would think, into something around citizenship, which gives it connection to everything.
Agreed.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're seeing sort of AI built into the whole, across the curriculum, so not just sort of pigeonholed in sort of computer science or computing curriculum, which is important. We're going to get to audience questions in just a few minutes, but I would like to touch on this question of inequalities and accessibility around AI, which I think is important for us to talk about, especially in the context of different schools, different administrations. You mentioned a few examples earlier about the sort of freemium and free model versus the schools that will pay for certain types of tools. I guess framing it like this, how might the greater adoption of generative AI in education across institutions exacerbate issues around tech accessibility? We can look at it from the national perspective or internationally, as I think Professor Knox also suggested earlier. I don't know if anyone wants to jump on that first.
I'm very happy to dive in. In my mind, there's instantly a tangle of a whole different set of barriers to accessibility here, because I feel like the digital divide, it's about money to a degree, but there is also literacy too, which in the Venn diagram of reasons why you might be excluded from digital society in one way or another, that the intersection of, I suppose, vulnerability in terms of literacy and vulnerability in terms of poverty, that is the really the pits, right? Those folks who are the least well served by tech and the least able to access it are excluded from these spaces entirely. So I would love to see vehicles in the UK and beyond that support programs for inclusion in terms of the literacy piece as well as the accessibility piece. And we know, don't we, that this isn't just around giving people access to a platform. It's also devices, it's a reliable internet connection. It's, that whole connectivity aspect is so much more complex than we imagine. And there are schools in the country, and I'm very fortunate to work at one of them, where every single child from the age of 8 upwards has their own device that is filtered and monitored and all the rest of it. They use that for work, and it is a really great digital literacy tool for them, as well as for their whole teaching and learning experience. There are other schools where children might once a week be able to access an IT suite that is crumbling, and it just takes them 10 minutes to log in. And there is no way that as part of their school experience, they will be experiencing this kind of stuff. They will find it on their phones. It will be via Snapchat. It will be via whichever other platforms that they're using. And so therefore the associations they have with those experiences are nothing to do with academic life. It's part of the rough and tumble of their social media world, which often those stories remain untold in school. And it's very much behind that private, personal barrier. So I think in terms of safeguarding, there's a worry there for me around the accessibility limitations for less privileged children, but equally how that actually makes them more vulnerable to grooming, to experiences around synthetic intimacy that could lead them down some dark pathways, creating dependencies as well for those who are vulnerable or isolated or have any number of learning disabilities or difficulties. All of those things could lead them more vulnerable to manipulation. And that's where I think we link back to questions around actually safeguarding, but also to sort of police and criminal level too. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit doom and gloom. Apologies.
Well, let me give a counterpoint. So cost isn't a barrier to kids owning computers anymore. I'm afraid we fixed that. We really did. That isn't the barrier. Now we need more semiconductors so we can make more Raspberry Pis, but like the cost of technology has come down. Internet's a real problem. We do a lot of work in India where even if you can get the devices into the hands of young people and teachers so that they can get hands-on with some of these technologies, internet access is still the big barrier. We're doing a lot of work at the moment about offline educational resources, and lots of people have contributed to that. If I stay focused on the thing that I probably care most about in this discussion, which isn't the use of AI to improve teaching and learning, I think that's kind of important, but lots of other people. I care most about how do we ensure that children from disadvantaged backgrounds aren't left behind by the pace of this technological advancement, right? We know that when personal computers came out, when the internet came out, kids who came from disadvantaged backgrounds, not just inside the UK but thought about globally, were left behind. The gap grew enormously. And this is another wave of technological innovation which is likely, unless we're very thoughtful about it, to make that gap accelerate even quicker. So the opportunities will be most available to the most privileged kids and least available to the kids who are least privileged. And fundamentally that comes down to changing what happens in schools or other learning environments which they're in. It's about having curricula and well-trained, non-specialist teachers and other educators in and around those young people. And looked at from the prism of the UK, what that really means is that we find ways to make the curricula available and then invest and focus on helping those schools realise how important it is they prioritise this, and prioritise it at a young enough age that it impacts young people's choices about what they study. And that we support the teachers and educators that are around them. So yes, internet is a problem. We haven't solved that, but like honestly, we can get kids devices. Like $65 is not that much, really.
Okay, right, quite right.
Sorry.
I think I would want to emphasise that the digital divide goes way beyond merely access to technology. The research has been talking about this for a long time. It's about what one is able to do when one gets access, and there's a whole raft of issues there. And of course, one of the education ways into that is to talk about skills. I think this is an area that education technology for development has failed for a long time. It's not simply about putting the devices into the hands of people. It's about the understanding the environment that they're in and their ability to get the best use out of this technology. Maybe I can just provide you with one example of the kinds of uses of AI in education that I researched a few years ago. This is not necessarily generative AI, but if you think about, on the one hand, a classroom of students sitting together, there's a teacher at the front of the room, each one of them has a computer device or a laptop or something in front of them that's using a personalizing AI system. There's whole class teaching with the teacher at the front. There's combinations of that with students individually using computers. And this is the kind of environment that I would sometimes discover. On the other scale, one would discover classrooms where a teacher was not very often present or at the back of the room, and that classroom space would be comprised of a very close series of personal computers and students in front of the computers for most of the lesson, engaging in a one-to-one relationship with the personalised platform system, preparing for assessments and so I don't think it takes too much to guess which one is the richer educational environment through which those young people would get more out of an educational experience. So it's really, I think, about not so much about putting the technology into the hands of young people, it's really thinking carefully about how it's used and how it's incorporated into a useful educational experience, and one that's recognises the context that those young people are in.
We shouldn't allow AI to de-skill teachers or usurp their authority in some way in terms of their pedagogical skill and their ability to create those rich environments. It should be an amplifier for that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, with that, we'll open the floor to questions on this topic or any topic.
Okay, so building off of what was discussed just now, hello. So I think there's discussion and there's validity in this discussion about the digital divide from an economic perspective. And I think that is something that has been studied at length. But what really captivated me is, and my point of interest is like the psychological and psychosocial divide. And so like Laura, I think you described the attention economy kids groomed in a culture of artificial critique and skepticism. Yeah. And so like I agree with that. Like there's a level of like more skepticism, scrutiny, and distrust of like what media comes forward. But then on the flip side, you also said like there are these kids who are more susceptible to like vulnerable experience, problematic use, being groomed and kind of hyper. How is that element of the digital divide? How do you see that being addressed, exacerbated, or?
Sure. So I think that's the first wall of defense, if you like, is safeguarding. Like schools safeguarding responsibility and leadership in terms of monitoring and caring for the students and ensuring that everyone's as safe as possible, and the pastoral staff in school are well equipped on spotting the kinds of problematic behaviours or gateway kind of experiences that might lead to trouble in that space. I think that's really important. The piece around perfection, I think, is also really key, because I think if we're talking about those attention economy kids who have been trained to think that actually their authentic self, their flawed self, their skin with actual texture in it is, unappetizing to their friends or whatever, we need to find ways for them to experience authenticity and then understand the difference between that and an AI-infused world. And actually, the superpower is self-esteem. If we can help young people to believe in themselves, the value of their own voice, their own opinions, their own thoughts and dreams and hopes, and not feel that they need to use AI as a crutch, but actually that they are perfectly whole and capable and beings filled with potential, then we're doing a good job. If children don't hold those beliefs, then they are vulnerable to suffer in that digital have and have not situation.
Question.
Sorry. It's for the people in the live stream.
So I guess I want to go back to your question or your comments earlier about metaphors and finding ways to use metaphors productively to describe AI. And I've done some, and so I'm curious, it's like what metaphors would you propose using, and how do you see those as actually shaping students' interaction with the AI?
This is such a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. So some things that are problematic. We start with the things that are problematic. The printing press is problematic. And is because when we talk about the printing press as being as hugely important, pivotal moments in history, kids are like, yep, so? Utterly unimpressed by the magnitude of that. And a lot of them have grown up with touch technology. They were the iPad kids who, like, we give them a book and they're trying to wonder why it doesn't scroll automatically. So unfazed by new technology in terms of hardware, that's not going to be helpful. I think we need to be really careful about polluting imagery with robotics and moving away from that, and instead using imagery which is more representative of connections, pattern seeking, pattern finding, recognition, that kind of piece, and prediction. if we're actually looking at these things as, well, that's a really clever, huge statistical model. It doesn't sound very glamorous. It sounds much less magical. But actually, this is really good at predicting what's going to come next. Okay, well, let's think about it in terms of prediction. And that's obviously highly contextual, and that doesn't do a service to all of the capabilities. But for young people to understand a particular capability, I think that's useful. And so grounding it in simple language, simple imagery, that talks about connection, that talks about prediction, that's going to be helpful, I think. Would love to hear any suggestions that you have on good metaphors for that, but it's not a really cute robot dog, I promise.
So, just add, we've published a first attempt at taxonomies and libraries that you can use for language is the most important thing, right? I think images are important. We haven't even begun to address that yet, but language is the most important, and it's incredibly hard and contested. And actually, we work globally, and it's very hard to come up with something that works globally because the meaning attributed to words is so different. But yeah, we've published something, you can find it on raspberrypi.org, which sort of starts to tease out some of this. I think it's a work in progress, but I would say start with the language, which words you're using, what meanings describe.
Say it again, sorry.
Start with the language, yeah.
The name of the link, Raspberry.
So raspberrypi.org.
Just that.
Yeah, and if you look on there, you'll find on our blogs, I think there's a blog from me on there that links it.
We'll go to, next question.
Yeah, I had a question and a comment, or a comment and a question. The comment on the digital divide issue is, it turns out if you look at the statistics, about 15% of the British population is functionally illiterate, plus or minus, depending on how you define functional literacy. Those people are continuing to be reproduced in schools, and those are people who are going to have a lot of trouble figuring out AI, let alone anything else. So is there a way to address this through AI? Is there any issue here? So that's one point. The second question is really, you talked about personalization of learning, and I can see this in a math class, where there's a clear right and wrong answer, and where there's a clear hierarchy of learning, where you have to have some fundamentals and you go gradually advance upward toward higher levels. I don't see that nearly as well in an English class. Especially with the probabilistic model of writing. I mean, if you've looked at the AI writing, it's pretty flat. And it's like about 10th grade, year 11 in the British system, as a standard level. And it gets regularly sort of hooted at by good writers in various places like The Economist. But I wish you'd comment on this personalization issue with respect to English.
So I think that if this is all about leveraging the tools in ways that are going to help students improve, and that needs to be quite specific, rather than saying, produce a creative writing piece about, in Gothic style about X, Y, and Z. Instead, using it for Socratic questioning, using it for feedback on punctuation. Give me 15 examples of sophisticated vocabulary at reading age X, which can be used to describe an atmosphere of spookiness. Like you can use it to add breadth and depth through very specific questioning, rather than simply throwing the task at it and expecting model answers. But the model answer capability is really good when you are prompting it effectively. We can use it, for example, for model answers at different grades at, say, GCSE level, which is an examination level you do at 16 here. And we can then ask students to critique that output and have them improve it according to the rubrics for examinations, for example. So I think really this is about critical thinking and using the tools well to achieve the academic goals that you want, rather than just pressing a button and hoping that magic comes out and it's going to solve all the problems. Do you see what I mean?
Other comments on digital divide or?
Well, maybe the second point. I think the connection to mathematics or math is absolutely correct. I mean, the one of the first systems that came out to do platform-based personalized learning was the Alex system in the US, which I think came out of University of Illinois or something. I may not have that correct. That sort of model was picked up. The main company in the UK called Century or Century Tech picked up the very same model There's another example in China, a company called Square AI, based in Shanghai, picked up the very same technology that was built on some theory which they called knowledge space theory, which is about defining a domain of knowledge points. And the personalization is a algorithmically driven optimal pathway through those points. So you're absolutely right, it works very well for a knowledge domain where there is a clearly agreed upon right and wrong answer at every point. Works less well in an area like history, which is open to interpretation and so on. Although other of these companies have attempted to move into that space. But of course,
where there are schema and connected nodes of understanding, there can be tools which can help students develop, even if it's actually in a fairly straightforward, adaptive way, building from one piece to the next piece to the next. When you get past a certain point, obviously, in terms of nuance and social context and all of those things start getting more complicated. But for the most part, at a school level, there's some really good stuff to be explored there.
I just want to say one more thing. If there's 15% of the UK population who are functionally illiterate, I think the government should be ploughing more money into schools and teachers, not spending money on AI.
But I would say, just in response to that, if I may, using AI at the point where access is needed to those tools, whether it's applying for council tax or claiming benefits or setting up, opening a bank account or whatever else, we're going to need to inject accessibility options into those spaces at the source. And I think that's where those priorities should be, outside of the let's fix the problem properly. Yeah.
Great. We'll take maybe one more question. I saw your.
So I have two questions, and they're both kind of brief. One is more psychologically motivated. One, the second's more politically motivated. The first one, I was going back to the social contract between parents and children and teachers and children. And you're right that the buck is passed on to children a lot, almost disproportionately, when I wanted to know where adults could fit into this, whether there's the opportunity for schools to offer like meetings for parents and what they can do at home, and whether that's already happening, because I don't know. I don't have a kid in school at the moment. And then the political question is, I work on the online safety bill. How optimistic are you about the safeguarding potential of it in this context? And feel free to roast it, because it deserves scrutiny. It's going to affect a lot of lives.
Do you want to?
I don't know whether I want to comment on the online safety bill. Do you want to open that up just before we wrap up? I think it is really important that legislators and regulators are engaging with this. I think that we don't know the direction of these technologies. This is like, probably most of you too young, this is like the internet in the 90s, right? We kind of, it's horrible websites, and we haven't even begun to understand. I remember getting my first email address and going online, and it's so different to today. We haven't even begun to understand where this technology is going yet. So I think that just as in education, we talk a lot about mindsets rather than knowledge. So equipping young people with the mindset to engage with a rapidly changing technological environment, we need to be thinking about principles and standards when we're talking about regulation. That's. I will reserve my comments on the online safety bill for that. And on the parents and teachers thing, look, I've just stepped down actually. I've been a chair of school governance for 11 years, and the number of times people have said, well, if only the school could get parents to do more. It's not kind of how it works, right? I think that we have to remember that up until a certain age, sort of teenage kind of years, the purchasing power, the people who put things in front of students are teachers, school systems, and parents. And we should focus our intervention on the purchasing moment. And the purchasing might be free sometimes, it's about introducing. But if we think about it in that context, like what information does a parent have when they're deciding which technologies to put in front of their children? Like that brings a nice clarity, I think, to where we might try to intervene.
Can I add a couple of bits?
Sure.
So first of all, thinking about the online safety bill, and again, my think my political role here is very limited, so I'm not going to overstep. But I would just say, could we go a little faster? Because years and years that took to get to this point, and we're not at a point where anything is future-proofed in terms of AI moving forwards. The government has been really keen to articulate its vision for 2030 for us being some kind of global superpower in the UK in terms of AI. Love the ambition, guys, but please don't forget the kids, because my goodness me, when social media all came through, so Web 2.0 just ignored young people and children and their needs, and we will live with the consequences of that for always now. It's not going to go away. So I think we need to do better in terms of our ambition for caring for the people and not just the things. Forgive me, I've lost my track on the second thing.
Parents.
Say again, sorry?
Helping out parents.
Oh, parents. The parents who show up are the parents who are the ones who need to be there the least. We love those parents. They come to everything and they care deeply about their kids and they really want to learn. But the ones that we need to reach are the ones that are hardest to get in the room. And those are the people who need to hear the messages the most. And so finding disruptive ways to reach parents who don't connect well with school, who don't see school, for example, as a source of useful information, or who actually even maybe resent being told what to do by school. Those are the folks that we would need to find disruptive ways of reaching.
Great. Do we have any final comments as we wrap up?
Only thank you, because this has been fun.
Yeah, no, it's been fun. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you.